Hey, I've got a quick trivia question for you. Who is the first person to cross the Trans Canada Trail from coast to coast to coast, walking, cycling, cross country skiing, snowshoeing, and canoeing their way from the Atlantic to the middle of a country, up to the Arctic Ocean, and then back down and across to the Pacific Ocean? Don't worry if you didn't know, I didn't know it either, until just recently. The first person to make this incredible journey was an amazing woman named Dianne Whalen. Follow up trivia question: what year did her journey take place? What if I told you that her journey started in July 2015 and concluded 6 years later in 2021? Would it surprise you that it happened so recently and we haven't heard much about it? Personally, I know I buried my head in the sand for a few years after the worst of the pandemic was over. And so I know that means I missed a lot and continue to miss a lot because I'm still pretty averse to the news. But for real, did you hear about this accomplishment? Okay, well, let's do an easier trivia question. Have you heard about the guy with a prosthetic leg that ran across Canada? No, not Terry Fox, the other guy. The one who successfully ran from the Atlantic to the Pacific between 1983 and 1984. Just a few years after Terry had to abandon his run when tragically his cancer returned. The guy I'm thinking of is Steve Fonyo. Most young people, and even some of us older folks, aren't aware that a man with a prosthetic leg has run from the east to the west coast, completing what Terry Fox set out to do in 1980. Now, there's a good reason for that, or maybe multiple reasons, or maybe some not so good reasons, all of which we need to interrogate. And we'll do that shortly. But as well as those two stories, I also want to remind you today about a grandmother who spent over a decade walking 27,000 kilometers around the Great Lakes multiple times, as well as other North American water bodies. Her name was Josephine Mandamin. If you haven't heard of her, perhaps you've heard of her niece, water warrior Autumn Peltier. Autumn was inspired by her great aunt Josephine's role in advocating for the protection of the planet's waters for all people and all of nature that depends on water for life. Oh, and I'd also like to talk about the Canadian who walked across the globe, crossing 6 continents and 64 countries, and devoted the 11 plus years it took to the United Nations Decade for Nonviolence and Peace for Children. While some of the names from our earlier trivia questions may have stumped you, surely we can all recall the name of a man who walked across the world. That's right, of course I'm talking about Jean Béliveau. That name must sound familiar, right? No, not the famous hockey player of the Montreal Canadiens, the other Jean Béliveau. I know what you're thinking. Geez, Craig, slow down. Focus, man. Sorry, sometimes I get a little too excited. Okay, so there's this beautiful, relatively little known documentary film called 500 Days in the Wild about one woman's journey to become the first person to traverse the entire Trans Canada Trail system from coast to coast to coast. The film was created by Dianne Whalen, an award winning Canadian documentary filmmaker and accomplished photographer, artist, storyteller, author, and public speaker who has tackled capturing life in some of the most extreme environments, such as when she crossed more than 2,000 kilometers with Canadian and Indigenous Army Rangers in the far north, and when she filmed and later wrote about her experiences on Mount Everest. Full disclosure, there will be spoilers in this story about her film. However, I believe you still need to experience her documentary yourself. It is incredibly moving and inspiring. But if you're the kind of person that likes to experience movies or books without knowing anything about them, you may want to skip ahead to the next story. Whalen opens her film stating that she's not sure what she'll find on her journey, but she knows what she's looking for. Although she doesn't explicitly give words to what she is seeking, it quickly becomes clear that her expedition is deeply rooted in personal introspection, environmental consciousness, and cultural reconciliation. When the idea started to form in her heart and her mind to become the first person to cross the Trans Canada Trail, Dianne was in a vulnerable place, needing to do something to recenter herself and cope with previous challenges, including a failed marriage and the recent death of her dog and beloved companion of 14 years. At the time, she was also struggling, as many of us are, with the endless doom and gloom we're bombarded with daily. Doom scrolling, terrifying headlines, anxiety, and uncertainty about the future. In one of her more poetic statements, she says, quote, "Sometimes it feels like we just lost the heart of the story. We used to live in a society, and now we live in an economy. What will then follow in 500 Days in the Wild will be a stunning sequence of point of view POV shots, panoramas, drone footage, stills, and artistic impressions of the Canadian wilderness all across the trail, as well as some guest appearances of people she meets and people that came along during some legs to support her. What begins as very much a solo quest, similar to the stories of Canadian hermits we explored last week, eventually evolves into a hybrid of self reliance and interdependence as Dianne learns that she can't do it all on her own. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, quite the opposite. But I'm getting too excited and jumping the gun. Let's make sure we understand where Whalen's head was at prior to her first step on the trail. She was clear from the beginning that she wanted to honor the ancestors of the land and water she would need to cross to fulfill her mission. She takes us along with her on a trip to Haida Gwaii that occurred a few months prior to the start of her journey, where she meets with an elder, Fern Williams. She asks Fern for advice on how to best do that. After spending time off camera, talking and sharing tears about the missing and murdered Indigenous women across North America, the camera captures one of the most powerful moments of the film. I'm not technically giving it away because she often mentions it in her speaking engagements, interviews, and in her TED Talk. This is the moment when Elder Williams gave Whalen, who prior to their meeting was a complete stranger, a sacred eagle feather. The moment is one of those rare moments between strangers where people come together openly and, through kindness, receive each other and seek understanding, forging a bond that will last a lifetime. Vern explains the eagle's feather significance to him and that he wants it to accompany Dianne on her journey. He tells Dianne that we come to understand the things that are important in life because of how much it hurts to let them go. This feather, he says, is one of those things. It hurts him to let it go as he gives it to Dianne, but he knows in his heart that it will help her in her journey and allow her to stay connected to the ancestors as she's intended to do. Elder Vern says, quote, "We have been here forever, and we fight for the things worth fighting for because Mother Earth is worth fighting for. We will never give up," unquote. Dianne commits to, quote, "carry this feather wherever she goes on her journey and hold space to respect the ancestors of the land," unquote. Vern also encourages her to smudge each morning, and that ritual will help connect her to the land wherever she is. In later interviews, she will refer to this quest as a, quote, "ecological pilgrimage," unquote, with the aim of reconnecting with nature while honoring the land and water. She shares she sought to move away from a society driven by economic pursuits and instead immerse herself in a natural world, fostering a deeper understanding of the environment and her place within it. Throughout the journey, she plans to engage with and learn from various First Nations peoples and their traditions and perspectives. On July 1st, 2015, Whalen is in St. John's, Newfoundland, and with her bike packed, off she goes. Dianne foreshadows what happens next when she says that she isn't really an extreme athlete and doesn't really know what she's doing. She has a plan, but it's not based on firsthand knowledge and experience. As you can imagine, things don't go well at the beginning. After 10 days, she has only covered the distance she initially estimated she could travel in 3 days. At that point, her plan gets discarded in the fire, and she begins the process of surrendering herself entirely to the journey. Instead of obsessing over arbitrary distance or time goals and measuring sticks, she focuses on being present each day and to stay the course, no matter how long it takes. Early on, during one of her paddling portions of the trail, Whalen shares her healthy fear of and respect for water, which she developed earlier in life when she almost drowned during a kayaking adventure. It doesn't take long before she is reminded, while on the open water, that things can change in a heartbeat, and those who aren't careful and cautious can get into real trouble, which in some cases results in death. During one paddling leg of her trip, the wind and current shift rather abruptly, and Whalen has to struggle to make it to shore before capsizing. The experience is jarring for her, and she is visibly shaken as she proclaims to the camera and to herself that the water now has her full respect. Now, Whalen is an incredible storyteller, which becomes evident within the first few minutes and frames of her film. But it's her personal anecdotes and reflections throughout the journey that makes the film so valuable. A few weeks into the trek, she mentions that her father helps put things into perspective during a phone call while she's on the trail, when he mentions that what's happening in the news or across the world must not really matter much to her. She agrees and says, yeah, what matters most to me is the weather, water conditions, animal prints in the mud, and who I am sharing my space with right now. As she nears completing a 40-day paddle across Bras d'Or, she is greeted by then Grand Chief Ben Sillyboy of the Micmac, who lived at the Wequakmak First Nation in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Somehow he has heard about her journey, and he and his family have come to greet her and welcome her. Dianne is moved at their kindness, stating, quote, "After all that's happened between white settlers and indigenous people, this is what grace looks like." Unquote. The Micmac people she meets in the community take time to share things with Whalen that will help guide the rest of her journey. They teach her that how you travel is less important than how you connect with the places you visit. She is encouraged to say with each paddle stroke, the water is sacred, and with each step to say, the earth is sacred. That, they tell her, is how to travel with respect and reverence for what sustains life. However, a few weeks later, she hits a low point after about 100 days on the trail when she's caught in a rainstorm at night and pushing her bike through the mud while realizing she's lost and she has no idea what she's doing. She has lost 5 tents. Some were lost to the elements, while one was due to carelessness, and it must have slipped off her bike somewhere. But just then we see headlights approaching. This sight simultaneously evokes two emotions: fear and relief. Will the occupants be the nasty people we read about in the news that do unspeakable things to women they encounter on the side of the road? Or will they be kind and willing to help her? This turns out to be a good neighbor who noticed the bike tracks in the mud and was concerned that someone was out at night in this remote area. He drove around to investigate and found her. The kind man's name is Brad, and he and his buddy are good people. They give Dianne a warm meal and a place to sleep for the night. Their kindness and empathy melts your heart when you see these big burly bushmen in their rustic hunting shack cooking a meal on a hot plate for a complete stranger. Dianne reflects on this moment, stating, quote, "When you look at the news, you think the whole world is full of psychopaths, and it's not. It's full of kind people. To clarify, there are indeed evil people in the world, and Dianne possesses a privilege that many women from more vulnerable populations may lack. But she is right. The world is mostly good, but the bad is so bad that it gets most of our attention." Around 50 days later, Whalen is still focused on this point when she states, quote, "Before I left, I was worried about what happens if I meet a mean person or animal. By day 150, that hasn't happened, so those fears are starting to go away." Unquote. She also addresses what many people are probably thinking at this point in the film. Doesn't she get lonely all by herself? Seeming to anticipate her audience's reactions, it is here that she takes time to share, quote, "I feel like I'm just myself out here, and I feel the connection of all things." Unquote. She will also share that she still has a connection through phone calls and people who meet up with her during resupply stops. Whalen visits Cecilia Brooks, a water protector who has a background in science and also in Indigenous culture, traditions, and knowledge. Cecilia tells Dianne that, quote, "The river, she speaks, because when there's an imbalance, we see it. We've forgotten how to listen." Unquote. When we discuss Josephine Mandamin a few stories later, these words will still resonate. Brooks shares several important insights, but the one that I found most profound and exciting is her belief in what she calls a two-eyed concept of knowledge. Brooks explains that this view is about combining Indigenous traditional knowledge with science. By blending both perspectives, without considering one to be superior, we can achieve a more holistic understanding of the world. Whalen is eventually joined by a friend who helps her with some challenging paddling and portage sections of the trail. We witness Whalen transition from a cyclist to hiker to canoeist to cross-country skier and snowshoer and get an idea of what her camps look like in all 4 seasons. When she is back alone on the trail, Whalen shares an insight that provides an intriguing perspective. She says, quote, "Humans are just 0.01% of all life on Earth. So I've been connecting to the other 99.99% of life on this journey." Unquote. Similar to when you see Earth from far away in space and it makes you feel teeny tiny, this statistic has the same effect. It makes you realize that we are part of an enormous system of living things, and it highlights how small our role is, prompting a different perspective of the world around us. Dianne reflects on some indigenous wisdom she received that helped further the knowledge Grand Chief Siliboy and the Micmac community told her about water and earth being sacred. She shares, quote, "It can feel like there's a big gap between indigenous worldview and the Western worldview. I was told not to paddle on the water, but with the water. To not walk on the earth, but with the earth." Unquote. I have to say that I feel like it is such a blessing that so many Indigenous people from different parts of Canada were willing to share their understanding of the world with Dianne, and B, that she took the time to so vividly portray how she applied and observed that wisdom so that we, her audience, can learn from it too. While the majority of the trail involves interacting with peaceful creatures in the wild, Dianne does have a close encounter with a black bear within days of a fatal bear attack not far from where she and her partner Louisa are camping along the Mackenzie River. Louisa, who we get to meet about halfway through the film, stays with Dianne for part of the trip, becomes Dianne's girlfriend. Together, they share their story with us as we witness their love. And as Dianne describes, the two of us, one tent, one canoe, relationship boot camp. You can see, hear, and feel Dianne become more comfortable and peaceful after Louisa falls in love with her. The two encounter BC wildfires in record-breaking 48.9 degrees Celsius heat and other drastic changes to the landscape and climate along the route. They overcome many other challenges, including dangerous rapids that Dianne probably couldn't have navigated alone. Louisa isn't able to stay for the entire rest of the journey, and for the last couple of years, Whalen has to contend with a few more obstacles and challenges. One big one is the COVID-19 pandemic, which hits as she's alone in the wilderness, on the trail during a time when lockdowns are forcing people to stay indoors, which means she has to figure out how to coordinate resupplies. I won't spoil how this gets solved. I will tell you that Dianne makes it to the end of the trail successfully. That's not a secret. It's in the trailer. On August 1st, 2021, in Victoria, BC at Clover Point, she marked the end of her epic 6-year, 1,862 day, 24,000 kilometer journey. And this next part isn't a secret either. She speaks about it in her TED Talk and in interviews. Oh, that reminds me. After or before you see the film, you should consider checking out her TED Talk too. She does a wonderful job of summarizing her key lessons learned along the trip. So remember that sacred eagle feather Elder Vern Williams gifted her before she embarked on her journey? Well, it made it to the end with her safely. And before the film closes, Whalen returns to Haida Gwaii, where she presents the feather as a gift to Williams' granddaughter, who was born while Whalen was on the trip. The feather that has now been from coast to coast to coast and kept her safe and grounded is now back where it started and gifted from stranger to stranger with kindness and understanding. Cue the tears. Elder Williams reminds us that hope for the future of Mother Earth is worth fighting for. Dianne reflects back on her project and says, quote, "For me, the journey has always been about hope, because we have so much fear these days. As a woman, I was scared to be out alone. I have met nothing but kindness during my 6 years on the trail. We give shadow much more attention than good on the front page." Unquote. As a result of her journey, she has been instilled with, quote, "incredible hope for the future and that we will find a way to move forward together, all as one." Unquote. Hope is the strand that ties all of today's stories about pilgrimages together. Each story revolves around an individual who, aided by an invaluable supporting cast, traverses vast distances and surmounts obstacles to foster hope for diverse causes, ultimately leading to a brighter future for all. But Just before we get into the next story, why the heck aren't more people talking about Diane's accomplishments? For goodness sake, she was the first person to complete the Trans Canada Trail. Seriously. Is it because she finished it so close to the worst part of the pandemic that it got overshadowed? Or is it because since then we've been so focused on divisive politics, had a prime minister resign, and watched contentious elections to the south and then her own election too? Is it difficult to convey the scale of something as big as what she did? Whatever the reason, I hope that more people start to notice what Dianne Whalen did. While crossing the trail is impressive, the additional valuable insights, introspection, reflections, and meditations gained from Indigenous knowledge and perspectives shared along the way make me believe that this will eventually become mandatory viewing. Okay, maybe that's a little extreme, but if even a little bit of what I shared with you intrigued you, you can stream the film on Paramount Plus or rent it from Prime Video. But before you do that, remember, I still have 3 more awesome stories to tell you. All right, thanks for sticking around. Let's begin with John Béliveau. And don't worry if you haven't heard of this John Béliveau before, or maybe you've just forgotten about him. I was joking when I referred to him as a household name earlier. Jean Béliveau was born in Asbestos, Quebec on August 18th, 1955. He was the oldest of 5 children and grew up on his parents' dairy milk farm in the province's eastern townships. While little is known about his early life and pre-walk life, we do know that he was in a long-term relationship and had 2 children who were 18 and 20 by the time he struck out on his walk on August 18th, 2000. He was also married to Luce Archambault and had sold his neon sign business. Some reports state that it went bankrupt, but I can't tell if this detail is accurate or if it was just an easier narrative to spin to explain what drove him to walk away from his life at the time. Over the years, Jean typically refers to 2 or 3 motivations for beginning to dream about walking around the world. The devastating ice storm that hit Quebec in 1998 rendered a significant portion of the province powerless for multiple weeks. This made John realize how fragile everyday life and routines were, but also how seemingly meaningless much of his day-to-day routines were, as they could all be paused for such a long time and the world wouldn't end. He suffered what he sometimes calls a midlife crisis and other times refers to as depression. He is French, so perhaps he uses those terms interchangeably to mean the same thing when speaking in English, or perhaps they were 2 different things, or 2 co-related things. Either way, there was a significant mental shift and challenge or struggle he was coping with. The third thing he mentions, less frequently, is that he felt that he didn't fit in. He said he'd always been a dreamer and felt somewhat restless. As everything reached its peak, Béliveau began walking and eventually running as a way to cope with the things that plagued his mind. Exercise, after all, is normally the first thing people recommend to people suffering from things like depression or other mental health issues. While walking and running, John began to experience a newfound sense of freedom and an escape from some of his worries. As he got more in shape and was able to increase the distances he ran, one day while crossing the Jacques Cartier Bridge, the sidewalk seemed to beckon him to keep going, and he found himself starting to wonder about things like how long would it take to run from Montreal to New York, and then how long might it take to stretch that further and run all the way to the Mexican border. Before long, the thought of running around the globe and crossing oceans and continents entered into his imagination. He then spent the next 8 months thinking about and plotting potential routes and strategies to actually make this dream a reality. He did this all covertly and waited until just a few weeks before his planned departure to tell his wife that he was planning to walk around the world. In his 2012 TED Talk, Jean shared that Luce initially asked whether he would be coming home at all during his walk, and when he replied no, she then inquired if that meant he wanted to separate. After he clarified that he did not want to separate, they discussed the possibility of her visiting him wherever he happened to be during his walk. The couple planned that once a year, Luce would visit him. He told Luce that he, quote, must go, and it wasn't about wanting to leave her. It was just something that he knew deep down that he needed to do. Maybe you too have felt this push or pull in some direction and know what it must have felt like for Jean as he grappled with following his heart or ignoring the call. Surprisingly, Luce was very supportive right off the get go. She encouraged him to think about a cause or a why to anchor his walk to. They decided that Jean should dedicate his walk to the UN's Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence for the Children of the World. Jean described this decision as one that gave his walk a real purpose and a, quote, soul, unquote. Luce, for her part, agreed to stand behind her husband and coordinate things from her end to fundraise, help finance, and update his website to share his journey through a newsletter to friends, family, supporters, allies, and other stakeholders across the world. She and Jean would plan a honeymoon each year where she would visit him, and the couple would spend a few weeks together exploring and enjoying whatever part of the world John was at. Luce and John reviewed his planned route, which would take him from Quebec deep into South America, and then to Africa, up to Europe, across Asia, down through Australia, and then back to Canada on the west coast, before crossing the country to return home to Montreal. Luce agreed with Jean's calculations that it would take 10 years to complete the trek, and then the two of them scrambled to pull together all the behind-the-scenes logistical requirements for starting on such an adventure. Things like networking with Canadian consulates and embassies around the world and in Ottawa, securing letters of endorsement from high-ranking officials, such as the Mayor of Montreal, to assist with making entry into foreign countries more smooth, as well as recruiting sponsors, and packing Jean's three-wheeled jogging stroller, yes, the kind to push babies in while walking or running, with supplies, a first aid kit, some food, clothes, small tent, and sleeping bag. And then, on his 45th birthday, Jean set off on what would be an 11-year pilgrimage around the world in support of peace and children. At first, Jean ran for the majority of his route as he traveled south to the border and then crossed to the United States. But by the time he reached Atlanta, Georgia, it became clear that he wouldn't be able to run around the entire world, and he adopted a slower pace from then on. Almost immediately, one of Jean's biggest fears about his journey went away when he found that people were more than willing to help as he traveled through Canada and the US by offering food and shelter or other items that would be helpful. As word spread about what he was doing, people welcomed him along his route, and he started to be invited to different events, talks, and meetings with organizations that serve children. Informal networks of allies started springing up as people got behind what John was doing. Occasionally, the people who put him up for one night would make arrangements for him to stay with someone they knew further down the line. Whenever Jean couldn't find people to put him up, he stayed in churches or camped or found other temporary shelters for the night, even sometimes staying, voluntarily, in prisons. By the end of that first year, he had walked to San Jose, Costa Rica, and showed no signs of stopping or slowing down. And although he doesn't have a favorite place or country from his travels, Jean does often share that he fell in love with Mexico during his time there, and that it's a very special place for him now. From Costa Rica, he walked to Chile the following year. People in Panama called him Forrest Gump, and Argentinians referred to him as Loco, the Spanish word for crazy. But in endearing ways, not in ways that were meant to be derogatory. It seems that most people he encountered got a kick out of what he was doing. Reflecting on those first 2 years, Jean would later say, quote, "I left with a very humble objective. I didn't know about peace. At first I just said to myself, just learn slowly and observe," unquote. For all the success of those first 2 years, there were several challenges that John had to overcome. He was burning through shoes at a rapid rate due to the daily grind of his walking, and his initial sponsor had been sold and were no longer available to provide him with new shoes. So he often had to make do with broken shoes for an extended period of time before someone came forward to send him new ones. At times, he would say that just finding food and shelter was a struggle. Some days he had very little to eat and was lucky if he came across someone who could give him directions or offer assistance as he traveled mostly alone in more remote parts of South America. However, it was during one of his treks across the Andes in South America that he met someone who walked with him and became his friend. That person told him, quote, "I've met some people who are so poor that the only thing they have is money," unquote. This was one of the most profound things John learned during his 11-year journey, and it would shape the rest of his life. Béliveau formed a friendship with gang members in Guatemala who at first appeared to pose a threat, but came to understand that Jean was not there to judge or interfere with their way of life. One of the armed gang members actually gave Jean some money to put towards his cause, stating that he himself had been a child soldier and it hadn't been a good life for a child. From Chile, he took a boat to Port Elizabeth and traveled north through South Africa over the next 2 years. In July 2003, while he was sleeping in a South African jail cell, the chief of police had agreed to let Béliveau sleep in the cell the night prior, neglected to tell the guards on duty the next morning. Those guards refused to let John out, despite his pleas that, quote, "I'm not a prisoner, I'm the Canadian guy walking around the world," unquote. It wasn't until another inmate, who was an actual criminal, became sympathetic to Béliveau's cause and joined in the shouting, prompting the guards to investigate further and realize their mistake, before apologizing and sending Jean along his way. While in South Africa, Jean met the mayor of Durban and gained his favor. The mayor then invited Jean to be his guest at an event where he could actually meet Nelson Mandela a few days later. Jean was overwhelmed and touched by such a gracious offer. A few days later, he found himself in a Mercedes as a VIP guest en route to attend the opening ceremonies of a youth center that Nelson Mandela had fundraised for. After the event, the kind mayor introduced Béliveau to Mandela, and Jean was able to shake Mandela's hand. According to Jean, Mandela told him, quote, "The world needs more people like you," unquote. Although he was a little in shock to be meeting such an iconic person, John had the wherewithal to give Mandela a signed picture of himself on which he wrote, quote, "Thank you, Mr. Mandela, for the inspiration you are giving for my walk, especially for all the children of the world," unquote. The significance of this meeting cannot be overstated, as it provided him with numerous opportunities in Africa. His picture was taken with Mandela and published in newspapers across the continent. Jean later said, quote, "If you meet Mandela, you are blessed," unquote. Jean referred to Mandela from that time on as his protector. People had told Jean that meeting Mandela would open countless doors across the continent, and Jean found that to be true. As he traveled north, he stayed with many locals who were aware of what he was doing, and because of the endorsement he received from Mandela, were happy to help him. He spent time with many people, eating their food, which he would later say sometimes included insects, and sharing their shelter. In more remote parts of the continent, he found that each tribe he encountered was very different from the last. It was during this portion of his walk that the constant state of culture shock started to fatigue him a little bit. He made it a daily ritual to quickly understand each culture, along with its rules and etiquette, to ensure he was both respectful and safe in his interactions with the people he encountered. However, sometimes that was a steep learning curve, and he would have to adapt and pivot quickly, and he found that mentally straining. You may be wondering by now how safe Jean was in remote areas and those with wildlife threats. Jean said at times he did carry pepper spray with him and was always on the lookout, being aware of his surroundings. Apart from encountering mostly small wildlife, the only close call he can remember occurred in Tanzania, where he was sleeping outside at night and he heard a very scary noise nearby that he thinks was a puma. But luckily it did not approach. In October 2005, in Algeria, he was in a significant amount of pain and was lucky to be provided with emergency prostate surgery by a prominent and well-known Algerian urologist who performed the surgery for free. This, paired with a trying few days in Ethiopia, where he was followed, mocked, harassed, and stoned by groups of children for consecutive days, started to get him down. From Ethiopia, he emailed Luce and told her he was considering calling it quits and returning home. He shared how challenging it had been to communicate with people there, and how, for the first time, he felt overwhelmed by the amount of culture shock he had consistently experienced over the last few days. But She convinced him to carry on and finish what he started, reminding him of the important mission of promoting peace and children's rights. Jean collected himself and recommitted to his mission. He had been incredibly fortunate to have made it this far with only minor incidents. Although he mentioned encountering 2 or 3 minor assaults, none were significant enough to bother him or cause him to fear for his safety. He then resumed walking, trekked to the highest point in Africa, and from there took a boat to Lincoln, England in 2006. In Europe, Béliveau was surprised to find that for the first time, people were cold, dismissive, and unwilling to speak to him or support his trek. This sense of rejection made Béliveau question whether he would be able to continue. He later told an interviewer that, quote, "Sometimes I would feel like a prisoner of my own dream. I wanted to escape the long journey," unquote. Eventually, Béliveau found pockets of Europe that supported and understood his mission. In Belgrade, Serbia, he walked with local officials, participated in a peace talk, and planted a tree with a group of children. By January 6, 2007, he reached the town of Rákoshyválvy, Hungary, which was an important milestone as it represented completing a distance that equaled the circumference of the Earth when measured at the equator. By all accounts, Hungary welcomed Jean with open arms and held festivities to celebrate this incredible feat. In India, Jean had the opportunity to walk with, quote, an amazing guy, Sadhu, who walked 30 years naked over 200,000 kilometers, unquote. Over the next few years, he walked across Asia to Indonesia, and along the way he stopped in Hiroshima, Japan, which he said was a solemn and disturbing moment, as Hiroshima remains a symbol of human tragedy. Armed soldiers had to periodically escort him through parts of the Philippines to ensure his safety. The sight of armed soldiers surrounding a man advocating for peace must have seemed somewhat ironic. In Manila, though, he participated in the Great Walk for Children, joining over 1,000 people who came out to attend the peace walk and show support for organizations like the Whalen Foundation that takes care of the children on the streets of the city. In China, Jean indulged in a delicacy that involved eating snakes. Now, you would assume that someone who walked as much as he did would have been good at looking after his feet, but he later shared that he didn't take good care of them and suffered through most of the walking. Oftentimes, he relied on donated shoes which didn't fit properly. His feet hurt so badly in China that he considered quitting, but when he reached Korea, people there provided him with insoles, which significantly improved his situation. In 2010, he traveled south down through Australia, where he encountered what he claimed was the most physically challenging portion of his entire trip. That involved 3 months of crossing the deserts of Australia, which were 40 to 45 degrees Celsius and offered little shade, water, or food. From Australia, he took a boat from Yarram to Vancouver before walking back to Quebec. He said in Vancouver, people told him he still had a very long way to go to get to Montreal, to which he replied, "What? I'm almost home." As he had done so often over the last 11 years, Béliveau leaned on the support and kindness of his fellow humans. In Canada, Canadians lined up to offer him places to stay and food as he walked over Rogers Pass into Golden, and from there across the prairies into Ottawa, before arriving back home on October 16, 2011. 134 months, 4,077 days, 75,543 kilometers, and 54 pairs of shoes later. He had successfully walked across 6 continents and 64 countries to raise awareness for peace and nonviolence for children around the world. Not to mention, he had met with 4 Nobel Peace Prize winners over the past decade. It would be easy to end the story here, but you know by now, if you've been a longtime reader or listener, that I like to go deeper and that I'm notoriously curious to know more about the people, places, and events that we explore. While Jean was walking around the world, he missed the birth of 2 grandchildren and the death of his father. Although he maintained a long-distance relationship with his wife and children and broader family, he was unable to be there for significant events, and when he got home, he had a lot of catching up to do. You can imagine how hard it was for him to return to his old life. In a TED Talk he gave in 2012, he stated that after 3 weeks, he was still feeling very lost at home. 3 months later, his wife said, "You are still forgetting to lock the door." And he said, "Sorry, in 11 years, I never locked any doors." Jean and Luce were bombarded with calls from media and news outlets and all sorts of organizations and causes that wanted to interview Jean or book him to speak about his accomplishments. It became too much for the two of them to handle on their own, so they hired someone to assist with answering the calls and booking Jean while leaving him enough time to focus on his family. It would be disingenuous to not share that Béliveau did face criticisms for his walk. Some called it self-indulgent, and others did not agree that he should have relied on the support of other people to fund his personal journey. To his credit, Béliveau acknowledged the trip was a privilege and that being an ambassador for peace allowed him to gain access to parts of the world that most people wouldn't be able to see. Over the next few years, Jean would continue telling people, quote, "I met thousands of inspiring people. Each of them had his or her own amazing story. The children were the most amazing and inspiring people for me. They tamed me to their cause. They taught me the beauty of simplicity." Unquote. Although his cause wasn't one that is easily measurable in terms of outcomes, from all the media coverage internationally during his walk and the volume of organizations he partnered with, it is clear that his efforts drew significant attention to the UN's cause, which is still being advocated and championed today. Unfortunately, in some parts of the world, children are unable to access education safely or live without the constant threat of violence. Behind the scenes, Jean was struggling. He would say that a year and a half after he finished the walk was one of the worst times he had ever had. He kept busy writing his book and giving lectures, but all the while he struggled with reintegration and the pull to return to the road. While he stated his next adventure will be a decade with his family to repay a huge emotional debt he owes them, one had to wonder how long it would be before Jean was drawn to return to his life of walking and being away from home. Between 2011 and 2015, John traveled to attend ceremonies and commemorations in countries he had visited during his walk, and after a few short years in Montreal, he started talking about making plans for smaller walks, including one through Colombia in December of 2014. It was one of the countries he had not been able to cross during his initial tour. While there aren't any interviews or news reports that I can find after 2015 about Jean Béliveau, I did find a report from April 23, 2016 about Luce Archambault with the headline, quote, "His ex-partner doesn't regret anything at all," unquote. After waiting for him, she now lives her own life, unquote. She tells the reporter that she doesn't regret devoting 11 years to helping Jean accomplish his goal of walking around the world. However, their relationship broke down in the years following their reunion. She is quoted as saying, "I'd had enough. I enjoyed working 40-hour weeks to support him when he was doing his walk from 2000 to 2011, managing all the logistics, but I was tired of it," unquote. After Jean returned from a 3-month trip away in the spring of 2015, the couple decided to separate. Although during Jean's epic adventure, Luce was often quoted as saying she felt like Penelope and he was her Ulysses, returning to life wasn't easy for either of them, and she claims he had changed when he came back. It soon became clear that he had different dreams and goals for their future. Now retired, she wanted to spend time doing what she wanted to do and enjoy free time. For some people who followed this story, it may seem obvious that Jean wouldn't be able to settle. One quote of his that illustrates this well is when he once said, "I'd rather be eaten by a lion than eaten by society." After a few walks and international visits, a documentary DVD release called Angels and Wings, and a book in French published and made available in Russia, Béliveau seems to have disappeared from public life. Perhaps Jean was meant to be a wanderer. As the cliché saying goes, not all those who wander are lost, and maybe he feels most at home when he's out walking, meeting new people, and seeing new parts of the world, while also having lots of time for silent reflection. Even if Jean Béliveau has stepped away from the limelight, why are we not continuing to talk about what he accomplished? There's not even a Wikipedia page in English. And I know Wikipedia isn't the gold standard for research. However, it is a good barometer for indicating whether a person or a place or topic has received significant mainstream attention. Is it as simple as the fact he shares a name with the great hockey legend and people lost track of him as a separate person who accomplished great things on his own? Is it because he is from French Canada and isn't covered as much in English Canada? Is it because he took a quote, gentle approach, unquote, to influencing change and that it took over a decade of small steps and conversations? He once said that traveling the world felt like attending a big university, which I have no doubt it would have felt like. Not continuing to talk about, engage with, or reflect on his experience means we are missing out on the opportunity to benefit from the education he received during his 11 plus years at that global university. Wherever Jean finds himself today, I hope he finds himself at peace and still able to do what he feels is most important and what brings him the most joy. He may have hinted at his own disappearance when he once said, quote, "When I came back, I had a very hard time. For me, life on the road was the real life. It's healthy to meet people, and the world is not so sad. Maybe I will just travel incognito for myself from now on." Unquote. So maybe that's where he is, traveling under the radar, no longer being tethered to a cause or the lifestyle he always felt he didn't quite fit into. Let's shift to a story that didn't take as long for the person to complete their goal. This one took just over a year, but like Jean Béliveau, this person isn't talked about anymore. Unlike Béliveau, the reason why we don't hear from him is because he sadly passed away on February 18th, 2022. This is the story of Steve Fonyo, a man who did what Terry Fox couldn't do: run across Canada using a prosthetic leg after losing a leg to cancer. Steve Charles Fonyo was born on June 29th, 1965, in Montreal, Quebec. He was the youngest child of Anna and Steve Fonyo Sr., who immigrated to Canada shortly after the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. When he was a child, Stephen Jr. and his family moved to British Columbia, not far from where he lived most of his adult life. When Steve was 12 years old, he received the life changing news that one of his legs had to be amputated because it was full of cancer. Reflecting back on that moment, Steve recalled, "I didn't even know what cancer was. My dad's the one who told me my leg has to come off. I thought he was joking and I started laughing my head off. Then I saw my mom bawling her eyes out and I thought, holy shit, this is not a joke." Unquote. It must have been devastating for his family, yet Steve insists he was young enough to simply accept it. Quote, "I wouldn't let it stop me from doing anything I wanted to do, and it hasn't." Unquote. Like many Canadians, Steve was inspired by Terry Fox, whom he'd watched on TV in 1980, just 4 years before Steve's attempt to cross the nation on his own prosthetic leg as a cancer survivor. Shortly after Fox died in 1981, Fonyo believed he had some type of an epiphany, and a voice inside him told him it was up to him to finish what Fox had started. "It came to me overnight. It was like a dream or something, like another force." Unquote. As he wrestled with the nagging feeling he was being called to a bigger purpose, he found himself struggling in school and dropped out in grade 10 to work in a lawnmower and chainsaw shop. He would later say about his school career that he liked some subjects but failed English, telling a reporter, quote, "I hate reading. I just can't do it, man." Unquote. There are hints here and there that Steve may have had a learning disability, but there is no proof that I could find, and Fonyo never seems to mention it. While school wasn't for Fonyo, he found he had a passion and skill for mechanic work and quickly made enough money to buy his first car before he was even old enough to legally drive it. Although there are obvious similarities between Fonyo and Fox, over the years, notable distinctions have also emerged. One difference is that Fonyo was never particularly interested in sports or athletic activities during his early life, and he didn't have the same philanthropic drive as Fox. He said, quote, "My heart wasn't there. Unlike Terry Fox's dedication, I always was a nice guy. I like helping people, but I wasn't interested in any way in running across Canada." Unquote. But once Fonyo started thinking about doing the run, he couldn't get the idea out of his head, much like Jean Béliveau, who was mentioned earlier. He would later say that in an attempt to have people dismiss the notion or talk him out of it or tell him he was crazy, he started casually mentioning it to people, including his doctor. He was shocked when most people commended him and supported him, saying that they believed he could, in fact, do it. In 2015, much later in life, Steve told the CBC's Wendy Mesley that when he was asked why he wanted to do the run back in 1985, it was a, quote, long story, unquote, but he just wanted to help people and do some good. Fonyo felt the need to get out there and do something, but it appears that he was never quite able to articulate why he felt that way. Perhaps he didn't understand that himself, which isn't all that uncommon. While some people who do great things are clearly able to conceptualize and communicate why they did what they did, many of us often feel like we should or could do something, but don't know definitively why. Or maybe we have many fragmented ideas that on their own aren't the driving factor, but when combined together are enough to catalyze us to act. By 1984, Fonyo could no longer resist the call to get out there and start running. With the support of his father, he approached the Canadian Cancer Society to partner with them, but was told no multiple times. The Society was protective of Fox's legacy and was not comfortable partnering with anyone who, inspired by Terry's journey, also felt compelled to raise money for cancer research. That refusal didn't dissuade Fonyo from moving on. In fact, it probably emboldened him even more to prove them wrong. So on March 31st, 1984, Steve Fonyo dipped his artificial leg into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of St. John's, Newfoundland, and began his epic 7,924 kilometer run across Canada. But early on, Fonyo's attempt at writing history encountered problems. His trainer, Romeo Gadbois, quit a few weeks into the run and publicly accused the teenager of faking injuries and other ailments. Fonyo's account of the events differ. He remembers dismissing his trainer, which infuriated Gadbois. There were also unsubstantiated rumors of donation skimming being whispered and allegations that Fonyo cheated by occasionally accepting rides. However, it should be noted that the head of the Canadian Cancer Society, which had since reversed their decision and had come on board to support Fonyo, adamantly denied that Fonyo cheated in any way, shape, or form. Fonyo's father and de facto coach also developed a reputation for being stubborn and hard to get along with, which caused tension behind the scenes. Additionally, the legacy of Terry Fox loomed over Fonyo, as many Fox loyalists were reluctant to accept young Fonyo as a hero in his own right, for fear of undermining the legend of Terry Fox. Fonyo himself was criticized occasionally throughout his run. Sometimes he wouldn't show up for scheduled events, and when he did, he didn't seem to be engaged or inspiring. Unfortunately for Fonyo, his personality didn't translate well in front of the cameras. It was also well known that while crossing the country, he would take weekends off and engage in extracurricular activities that some people disapproved of. However, it seems that initially people glossed over these things to maintain Fonyo's reputation as the next Terry Fox. But I did come across one article published in the Ottawa Citizen on June 11, 1984, by Sherry Barron that states, quote, "Since leaving St. John's on March 31st, Fonyo has consistently fallen short of his running schedule. Last week he was outside of Moncton, New Brunswick, and had gone 1,400 kilometers. That's 850 kilometers behind the progress Terry Fox had made on that same day 4 years ago." Fonyo partially blames his crowds of supporters for a slow pace, saying, "I really don't know what to do. They want me to stop for everything, a photograph, an autograph. Sometimes they just want to talk or give me money. I just don't want to refuse them, so what do I do? How do I tell them they're hurting my run? Terry Fox didn't have this problem." Unquote. Fonyo also had difficulties with his artificial leg. Fonyo said, "I lost quite a bit of weight, and the cup that fits over my stump became too big. Anyway, once Steve ran past Thunder Bay, it seemed he was able to escape from Fox's shadow. That's when more people started to get behind him and come out to cheer him on, and money started pouring into his campaign. As you may already know, so much of Steve Fonyo's legacy is based on what he did after the race. But before we get there, we should remember that this teenager ran for over a year, covering a distance of nearly 8,000 kilometers, and he did it while battling physical pain, emotional strain, public criticism, and the pressure of being in the spotlight at such a young age. Additionally, he sometimes had to endure the harsh Canadian weather during his journey. Fonyo was quoted as saying that the frigid -30 temperatures he experienced in northwestern Ontario were incredibly difficult. Fonyo also shared that at times the route was daunting and foreboding, and you could run for days without seeing anything but rocks and trees. There were times I thought I'd never make it, he said. Despite the advice from the Canadian Cancer Society to halt his run during the harshest winter months and resume in spring, Fonyo persisted, donning a winterized jogging suit and asserting that the only thing that could stop him was a recurrence of his cancer. Eventually, it became clear that Steve was experiencing severe pain in his right knee. About halfway through Manitoba, the pain became unbearable, and Fonyo sought medical care to have a doctor take a look, fearing that his cancer had returned. The doctor encouraged Fonyo to see a specialist, and Fonyo interrupted his run to fly back to Vancouver for medical tests. At the time, his father said, quote, he had approximately the same symptoms as he did 7 years ago, unquote, which terrified the teenager and his family. Fortunately for Fonyo, all the tests were negative, and Fonyo was diagnosed with shin splints, which are common among distance runners. After receiving medical clearance to resume his run, Fonyo returned to Manitoba, where he gave his critics yet another thing to latch onto. During a hockey game he was attending, a reporter from Winnipeg heard Fonyo comment, quote, Wayne Gretzky is a wimp, unquote. This blasphemous statement was blasted on front pages across the country the next day. The man who some felt was undoing a Canadian icon's legacy had insulted one of, if not, the greatest hockey legends our country has ever produced. After interviewing Fonyo about the quote, a particularly scathing report read, quote, Fonyo, an inarticulate kid from Vernon, British Columbia, with a passion for frisbees, pizza, and Pac-Man, denied the quote with the poise of a politician, unquote. Thankfully for Fonyo, the news cycle moved on as he continued running, and by the time he reached BC Place, thousands waited and cheered him on. When he finally reached mile zero on Vancouver Island, he arrived at a small beach that would be named in his honor. On May 29, 1985, he dipped his artificial leg into the Pacific Ocean, which he later told Wendy Mesley was, quote, the best day in my life, unquote. In total, Fonyo's Journey for Lives has been credited with raising approximately $13 million for cancer research, which is an incredible amount of money, especially back in the early 80s. With inflation, this amount would be approximately $41 million today. As he celebrated and the nation celebrated with him, streets were named after him and songs were written about his epic accomplishment. Steve Fonyo Day was declared in cities like Toronto, Ottawa, Winnipeg, and others. He couldn't go anywhere that would allow him to pay for his own way, and people lined up to buy him dinner and treat him like a hero. Awards and accolades also rolled in. He was named Man of the Year, Athlete of the Year, and became the youngest recipient of the Order of Canada at just 19 years old. Now a celebrity, Fonyo had the opportunity to interact with various celebrities such as George Harrison, Prince Charles, and Princess Diana. Wherever he went, people clamored to talk to him, take his picture, get his autograph, and tell him how much he meant to them. It turned out that his run didn't taint Terry's legacy and only enhanced it. The country learned that we could have more than one marathoner who fought cancer. Unfortunately, though, things began to unravel in February of 1986, when news broke that a bench warrant had been issued for Fonyo for failing to pay a $30 speeding ticket. Most initially sloughed it off as a minor detail that could be easily overlooked. But Fonyo's first major setback occurred in March, a month later, when it came to light that Monty Morris Friesner, who Steve had hired to manage his foundation, had an extensive criminal past. He had previously been convicted of fraud, arson, and possession of stolen property. The press pounced on this and cornered Fonyo, demanding he explain why he would work with such an individual. Fonyo didn't have a good answer and instead said that he always trusted his gut, and his gut had told him to go with Friesner. Fonyo seemed to emerge from this blemish later in the year when he stepped forward to announce he would be participating in another fundraising run for cancer research that would take him from the most northern point of Great Britain to its southern tip. But before this run was completed, Steve suffered a tremendous personal setback when his father, Steve Sr., died of lung cancer. Fonyo was only 21 at the time, and he stated, quote, "He was my best friend, my number one guy. I had nobody in my life. Nobody," unquote. Fonyo would eventually complete his run across Great Britain in May 1987, at which time he promptly announced he had no further intentions to continue running. If Fonyo's story had stopped there, perhaps he would be more fondly remembered, celebrated, and talked about. Unfortunately, Fonyo's legacy runs off the rails around this time, affecting both him and those he would end up hurting over the next few decades. Feeling lost and not knowing what to do with the pain and grief from losing his father, as well as not being equipped to cope with the burden of becoming a national sensation and Canadian icon, Fonyo spiraled. He fell into a deep state of despair, resorting to alcohol and drugs as coping mechanisms. He reached a critical point when he attempted suicide by driving his convertible off a cliff near Falkland, BC. Steve later said his father's death caused the downfall, but some say he was already in trouble even before the journey for lives. In 1982, Fonyo had been convicted of driving under the influence, which only surfaced in 1988 after he received 2 additional drunk driving charges that year. By the late 80s and early 90s, it seemed that Steve wasted all the opportunities that were available to him, such as failing to take advantage of a grant for helicopter training, failing to succeed as an Edmonton bank employee, and failing to use free tuition at the University of Alberta. Although the people who presented these opportunities to Fonyo had good intentions, they would have realized that none of them were suitable if they had taken time to understand him better. Later, his girlfriend would remark that it would have been better for him if he had received training in a technology or a hands on skilled trade. Failing to live up to the expectations society placed on him, Fonyo returned to working as a mechanic and experienced success to a limited degree. But he continued to suffer from what some have labeled a depression as he continued to self medicate and get into trouble with the law. Although Fonyo often maintained publicly that he never hurt anyone except for himself, in 1995 he was charged and convicted of assaulting his landlord with a wrench during a fight. As a result, his landlord required 30 stitches. The following year, in 1996, Fonyo pleaded guilty in an Edmonton court to multiple charges, including assault with a weapon, possession of a stolen vehicle, and fraud. In court, he admitted to writing over $10,000 worth of fake checks to purchase cigarettes, which he later traded for cocaine. As the charges piled on, one count listed 16 different charges leveled against him that year, which eventually sent him to jail for the first time. Across the nation and even internationally, headlines read, "From hero to zero," as the media reported on his shocking fall from grace. Throughout the 2000s, Fonyo continued to abuse alcohol and substances and get in trouble with the law while having volatile relationships with others. He ended up behind bars once more in 2010 after using fake credit cards to steal gas worth thousands of dollars. When questioned a few years later about his conviction, one reporter notes that Fonyo was far from repentant, as he quotes Steve as saying, "This system worked so well, it was just fucking unbelievable. And you know, I'd say 60-70% of it I gave away, like Robin Hood. I didn't make any money, but I could have been a millionaire." It's challenging to understand Fonyo's intentions, especially if they weren't aimed at accumulating wealth. His girlfriend Lisa stated that she believed his actions were motivated by the thrill of beating the system, which he seemed to take pride in. In response, Fonyo said, quote, "I'm not sure how to explain it. Maybe we test ourselves to see how smart we really are or what we are capable of doing. I wanted to just see if I could do it. I wanted to see if it was possible." Unquote. Fonyo then hinted at a deeper desire that he doesn't seem to understand when he claimed, quote, "I wish you were there to take a picture of it. Everybody loved me." Unquote. He explained how people lined up around the block to participate in his scam and benefit from receiving free gas purchased with fake credit cards. I believe this little tidbit reflects a larger aspect of Fonyo's psyche that he and possibly others did not comprehend. I think he had a strong desire to be liked and admired, and when that didn't happen, he often didn't know how to cope with it. During his years of alcohol and drug abuse, he often described himself as a, quote, "nice guy," unquote, in numerous interviews, which just didn't match up with how he actually behaved. At times, his need for people's approval seems to drive him. Shades of this shone through during Fonyo's cross Canada run, which at times alienated him from reporters and the public. They felt his focus was on his own image rather than on improving the lives of others. In December 2009, Fonyo was again disgraced publicly. This time, it was when his Order of Canada was revoked by the Governor General. At the time, he was only the fourth person to lose their award. This was highly controversial. Some believed that his criminal convictions made it inappropriate to list him among our finest citizens. Others thought it was unfair to take away the award, saying it was earned for what he accomplished during his run, and nothing he did after the run negated its impact and success. Fonyo himself doesn't agree with the decision. He is quoted as saying that the people from the Order of Canada should have helped him instead of taking away his award. A couple of years later, in 2011, Steve had racked up even more drunk driving convictions, served additional time in jail, and was convicted of 2 more assaults, one of which involved him assaulting his girlfriend Lisa. In an interview for a documentary titled Hurt about Fonyo in 2015, Lisa is seen telling Steve that he hurt her and punched her in the face. However, Fonyo downplayed the incident, telling one reporter, quote, "I never fucking touched her. She beats herself up," unquote. Fonyo seemed unwilling to accept responsibility for some things he did. In an interview with Guy Sadie for Vancouver Magazine in October 2013, Fonyo asserted his sobriety and commitment to a fresh start. Sadie writes, quote, "He's found his niche, and he's incredibly good at it. His eyes come to life when he talks about auto body repair," unquote. The article highlights that Fonyo is trying to make something of himself and is a good mechanic. When asked about how he became so skilled with cars, Fonyo told Sadie, quote, "It's a gift. Some people are born with certain aptitudes and certain skills," unquote. It was around this time that Fonyo became involved with filmmaker Alan Zweig, who would go on to produce the award-winning documentary Hurt that we've mentioned already. It covered the good, the bad, and the ugly parts of Steve Fonyo's life. Hurt portrayed a man trying to rebuild his life from the ruins of cocaine and alcohol addiction. In the film, the audience sees Fonyo swearing profusely, fighting, breaking up with his partners, and going to court. There's a moment in the film where the director takes Fonyo to Steve Fonyo Beach, but Steve doesn't want to go and becomes angry, storming off and refusing to set foot on the beach. He later said that he was just having a bad day. By the end of the film, family and friends said he was starting to do better. When Wendy Mesley once asked Steve what he thought about there being a statue of Terry Fox at Steve Fonyo Beach, Fonyo said it did bother him, but he meant no offense to Terry Fox. In Hurt, Steve blames the people of Canada for what happened to him. However, he later clarified that he did not mean it that way, explaining that he was just upset. As of late 2015, he claimed that he took responsibility for his actions and was seeking forgiveness. After the documentary debuted at the 2015 Toronto International Film Festival, it received a standing ovation. Fonyo, who was in attendance, later said that the moment, quote, "felt good," unquote, and that he believed that people were once again cheering for him and that people were ready to forgive him. When asked why he made the film, Zweig said, quote, "I thought it was a good story and I wanted to figure out how the whole thing happened. It's a tragedy, it's a trajectory that many people have suffered, unquote. He also added, quote, his story, I think, is particularly instructive because most stories of addiction and troubles do not have in the middle of them an extraordinary achievement like he did, like running across the country. It's an astonishing achievement, unquote. Following the debut of Hurt, when asked about why his life went so far down a dark path, Steve told Wendy Mesley that he really didn't know what happened that caused him to lose his way. Zweig said he thinks that, quote, 10 seconds after he finished the run, Fonyo started down a negative path, unquote. Zweig also said, quote, in some ways, the run was almost like a cry for help. His life may have gone this way anyway, but in some ways, I think the run made it go there more spectacularly, unquote. In 2015, Zweig and Fonyo were both interviewed by the CBC's Brent Bambury, and when asked about Fonyo's legacy, the filmmaker responded, I've said this before. If Terry Fox is a hero for running halfway across the country, then you cannot deny that Steve was a hero for running all the way across the country, unquote. In the same interview, Fonyo said that Zweig had helped him see things he needed to work on, and that his life was much more stable after his troubles. Quote, I need to do better myself, and I'm doing that, unquote. If you listen to the Mesley or Bambury interviews from 2015, you may find it difficult to understand Fonyo when he speaks. That's because in 2015, he suffered a beating so severe that he almost didn't recover. During a home invasion, he was stabbed and assaulted by 3 attackers who forced entry into his Surrey, BC home. Following the attack, he suffered a brain injury from head trauma and was placed in a medically induced coma for a month until he slowly started to recover. The brain injury affected his speech. But following Hurt and into 2016, Fonyo appeared to be trying to put his life on track. He reported that he still no longer used drugs or alcohol. In 2017, Zweig and Fonyo teamed up again to produce a sequel to Hurt titled Hope. It picked up Steve's story after he woke up from the coma and admitted he needed to make some serious changes in his life. Then, Fonyo largely faded from the spotlight for a few years, until February 18th, 2022, when reports of his death were published. He and his girlfriend Lisa had traveled to Vancouver so that he could have the foot of his artificial leg repaired. However, he suffered a seizure and died alone in their hotel room. Lisa found him unresponsive after returning to the room from running errands. Paramedics responded, but were unable to revive the 56-year-old. Following his death, Fonyo's niece Melody Krupa said Fonyo was a hero to her. Quote, he was 11 years older than me. I looked up to him. What I respected about him was that he had a lot of difficulties, but he kept going. He just persevered, unquote. She also called on the federal government to reinstate Fonyo's Order of Canada. Fonyo's partner, Lisa Herbert, told Global News, quote, he had the biggest heart and he loved people. That's why he did what he did. His personality was really big. It filled every room. Everybody that met him, most of them loved him. Some of them didn't. But you can't make everyone happy. He acknowledged his life and had some problems, but he was generally a guy who just loved people, unquote. His ex-wife, Lisa Greenwood Fonyo, stated, quote, a lot of people thought he was a total jerk, but once you got down past all that, he was a pretty good guy. He was incredibly smart, unquote. On February 24th, 2022, reporter Scott Radley published a piece in the Hamilton Spectator about Fonyo and shared that, quote, years ago, I spent a week with him for a feature I was writing about him. After hours and hours of conversations, I came to believe he legitimately had good intentions. At a time we're supposed to be more enlightened about addiction and possibly mental health problems, the near complete purge of Fonyo from the public narrative somehow seems unfair, especially when you wonder if this would have happened to him had he not faced the pressures of fame and expectations he was obviously ill-equipped to handle, unquote. Radley also believes that Fonyo's Order of Canada should not have been taken away. He goes on to make a case that we should not let Fonyo fade from history and writes, quote, surely, now that he's gone, we can find a way to give the man his due for the good he did and the magnificent feat he completed, unquote. If we had concluded this story about Fonyo by only covering his life up until he completed his journey for lives, we would have reiterated how significantly he contributed to cancer research funding. We would have remarked on how he demonstrated that one person's perseverance can create a lasting impact and inspire hope through determination. He once possessed the ability to bring a nation together and generate a worldwide influence, proving that anything is possible. However, even individuals who perform heroic deeds may not be destined to be heroes themselves. This presents us with a dilemma. Do we celebrate the accomplishments of people who've done great things, or do we celebrate the great people who have done things worth celebrating? Was Fonyo a teen star that suffered the fate of many other child and teen stars that are not equipped to handle their celebrity status and all the attention and public pressure that comes with it? However we talk about Fonyo, we must also avoid re-victimizing his victims. I don't want any of this story to diminish the ways that they have been victimized by Fonyo. And I believe we can discover a method to effectively share these kinds of stories. These stories are more complex than the purely positive or purely negative narratives we often talk about. They're much more nuanced, but ignoring them doesn't help anyone. It also sets a dangerous precedent that if we don't know how to think about or talk about something, it's okay to ignore it. We're better than that. And we have a lot of challenging stories that we still need to talk about. Sometimes it's only through having these difficult conversations that we can continue to grow and understand things better. Our last story is about a person who isn't polarizing, and in many ways, it is a less challenging story to explore. However, this story's importance continues to resonate today. This story is about Josephine Mandamin. She was a grandmother who took the initiative to walk over 40,000 kilometers around the Great Lakes and other water bodies in North America to raise awareness about the critical need to protect water, while also addressing issues with safe drinking water in Indigenous communities. Josephine Henrietta Mandamin ni Trudeau, whose Anishinaabe name is Bidashijba, the one who comes with the light, was born on February 21st, 1942. She was an Anishinaabe Odawa grandmother, elder, founding mother of the Water Protectors Movement, and a world-renowned water rights activist. Mandamin was from the Wikwemedong unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, located in Lake Huron, one of the 5 Great Lakes of Canada, on Turtle Island. The Great Lakes together hold the largest supply of fresh water in the world. She was a survivor of the Canadian Indian residential school system. From 1948 to 1954, she attended St. Joseph's School for Girls in Spanish Ontario. Despite the hardship she faced at residential school, she remained deeply connected to her Anishinaabe identity and continued to live by her traditional teachings. Josephine was married to Andrew Mandamin and was a mother to 8 children, grandmother to 13, and great-grandmother to 16 children. She and her family moved to Thunder Bay in 1979, where she worked for over 40 years serving the public. While working at the Kashadang Residence, a residence for students from outlying First Nations communities, and Mino Bimad Bimadoism, a group home for youth with mental health issues, she helped improve the lives of young Indigenous people. Somehow, she also found time to serve as executive director of Beendigen, which provides free support and services to ensure women and children have a safe environment to live in. And she also served on the Ontario Native Women's Association, ONWA, which empowers Indigenous women throughout Ontario to be leaders in their homes and in their communities. She retired from her 9-to-5 in 2006. But as we'll see, she didn't settle into a quiet retirement. Instead, she devoted herself to a cause we all owe her a debt of gratitude for, protecting something many of us take for granted: water. Josephine Mandamin had received a prophecy in the year 2002 during a Sundance ceremony at Pipestone, Minnesota. Grand Chief Eddie Benton Benez Badwayadan warned that if humanity continued to neglect water, by the year 2030, an ounce of water would cost as much as an ounce of gold. Wayadan warned that if water abuse continued, It would lead to severe shortages, and only those who could afford water would survive. He then asked those in attendance, quote, "What are you going to do about it?" Unquote. This prophecy deeply moved Mandamin and inspired her to take action and do something about it. By 2003, she too had become very concerned about the pollution of the lakes and rivers across Turtle Island, so she co founded the Mother Earth Water Walk. This began her journey to raise awareness about the importance of protecting water. Guided by her profound understanding of water, Nibi Gikandasowan, Mandamin brought together a group committed to confronting water pollution in the Great Lakes and on indigenous reserves. For context, Ogamau Anag Su Chiblo shares on the Water First website, a non government organization that works for sustainable water partnerships, that, quote, "The Western world believes water can be bought and sold, that it can be controlled, and it can be poisoned, that it needs to be managed by humans. The Anishinaabeg peoples believe water is alive, it provides life and can take life. The women are the keepers of the waters because we carry babies in water and that water can heal. Anishinaabeg peoples believe that water carries our ancestors' memories, and those memories are transferred from mother to child when a baby is in the water in the mother's womb." When I participated in the water walks led by Nokomis Josephine Mandamin, she talked about how the different lakes and rivers all have different personalities and water spirits. Water is life, and if the waters are healthy, then we are healthy. Unquote. As a grandmother, Nokomis, this role carried deep significance for Mandamin. Among the Anishinaabe, the title of grandmother is one of great respect and honor. And because women are keepers of the water, Mandamin, as a water keeper and respected elder, decided the best way to use her voice and fulfill her role was to walk around the Great Lakes and other lakes and rivers while carrying water in a copper pot to spread awareness about the need for everyone to work together to protect the world's water. The significance of the copper pot is that copper is believed to clean, heal, and amplify prayers for water. The first water walk began with a journey around Lake Superior, starting in Mandamin's home in Thunder Bay on the lake's shores. The initial 4,327 kilometer trek in 2003 took her more than a month to complete. That's like walking from Thunder Bay to Halifax. On the walk, Mandamin was joined by several companions, including Mario Wasik, Violet Kaibayosai, Melvina Flamand, and Thelkel Nuganijijic. Together, they carried the sacred copper pail and eagle staff, raising awareness about the importance of protecting water. Though the eagle staff is traditionally carried by men, Josephine Mandamin carried it with purpose and reverence during the water walks. Elders recognized her spiritual leadership and the sacredness of her journey, allowing traditions to evolve in a way that honored both the past and the responsibility she bore for future generations. Early on, Josephine told interviewers that the tremendous significance of the eagle staff she carried was a gift to her and her cause. After 2003, the walks became an annual tradition and were typically carried out during the spring, as the season represents a period of growth and renewal. In 2004, Mandamin and her allies walked around Lake Michigan. In 2005, the Water Walkers circled Lake Huron, which I live on in Little Owen Sound, Ontario, on the shores of Georgian Bay. I remember Mandamin and her group coming through Owen Sound that May. She was joined by a dozen or so water walkers, women, men, and children, who escorted the elder through town and over to the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation Reserve, about 20 kilometers west of where I live. They were led by a young boy who proudly carried the eagle staff high in front of them. Living on Georgian Bay, Lake Huron, had already made me aware of the Great Lakes contamination. My dad used to go fishing a lot when I was younger, and we'd often come back with a few salmon or rainbow trout, but over the years the fish started disappearing, and things like zebra mussels, lampreys, and higher mercury levels started to show up. By 2005, it was well known that you shouldn't eat too much fish from the Great Lakes because of the concentrations of mercury and other poisonous metals found within them. The risks were so severe that experts advised vulnerable people, young children, and pregnant women not to eat the fish. It wasn't always like that, obviously. It was widely known that if you went swimming in Georgian Bay or Lake Huron and unintentionally drank the water, you could almost guarantee a few days of sickness. Nothing major, but still pretty gross and pretty sad. Just a few days after the water walkers left the region, the Chippewas of Nawash unceded First Nation at Cape Croker were placed under a boil water advisory. And it wasn't the first time. The residents had already experienced a few advisories that year, and it was only mid May. All of this was just in my little corner of Canada, so multiply that across the country and further into North America, and you get a clear picture of why Mandamin took up the cause when she did. In 2006, she walked around Lake Ontario and followed that up with a walk around Lake Erie. By 2007, she had completed walking around all of the Great Lakes and was now 65 years old. Just because she was successful and persevered doesn't mean the work wasn't challenging. She and the other walkers frequently experienced severe blisters, and the walking exerted a significant strain on their joints and muscles. Sometimes they'd encounter people who were rude, dismissive, or who rejected the validity of what they walked for. In a 2014 interview, Mandamin shared that one time while walking on the American side of Lake Erie, people were driving by saying, "Crazy Indians." When we walked through Detroit, it was really scary. When we got back over the Ambassador Bridge to Windsor, my son said, "It's good to be back home." Unquote. It also cost money to travel, and she and the other walkers had weeks' worth of food and shelter to secure, which wasn't cheap. Still, if you ever saw Mandamin in person, on the walks, or in pictures since, you'll often see her with a warm, determined smile. It is clear that she is connected to and resonating deeply with the important work she was doing, despite the challenges she encountered along the way. In between walks, she continued her advocacy and became a member of the Great Lakes Guardian Council, a body established by the Ontario government to bring together Indigenous leaders, scientists, environmentalists, and community members to advise on the protection and restoration of the Great Lakes. And she also kept walking. Just because she had already circled each Great Lake didn't mean the mission was complete. Even today, the task of protecting them remains unfinished. In 2009, Mandamin participated in a National Film Board of Canada documentary titled Water Life about the state of Canada's freshwater lakes, rivers, and coastal salt waters. Josephine says in the film, quote, "When you drink of the water, you are part of that water, and as we are all part of each other, like we are all water, I don't care what color you are, the water is a uniter, uniting us together." Unquote. She goes on to say, quote, "You want to protect what is there, what is beautiful and free for generations to come. To walk with the water around all 5 Great Lakes to bring healing to the people through the water is what the Great Spirit moved me to do. There's a lot of apathy. People tell me I'm crazy." Unquote. I highly recommend watching the film, even if it's just to catch a glimpse of Mandamin and the other water walkers. It's so moving that they dedicated their time and effort to protecting the water we all rely on. Within the film, there are still many lessons and messages that remain relevant. One of the biggest takeaways is that it is frightening how little we understand about the cause and effect relationship between our actions and their impact on water safety and sustainability. Many things enter the water daily, and we don't know how they'll affect it. The film clearly points out that most municipal water systems were not designed to remove the chemicals and antibiotics and other things that we flush down the toilet or that seep into rivers from fields or that rain pushes down the streets and into gutters, into sewers, which makes its way back into the water. Even 15 years ago, traces of antidepressants were detectable in municipal drinking water. As one person on Water Life points out, quote, "When you go to the doctor and they prescribe you something and say, 'Now don't take this with these 10 other things,' well, those 10 other things are in the water you drink." Unquote. Scary. If history teaches us anything, it is that some corporations prioritize pursuing profit over ensuring they do not negatively impact the health of the Great Lakes and other waterways. Another historical pattern to consider is the government's inability to consistently monitor the water for our benefit. Sometimes they just don't have the resources or mandate or cooperation from industry partners. Other times, priorities shift. Think of the COVID 19 pandemic response or the most recent US and then Canadian elections. How much did we hear about the important efforts to safeguard water and continue to address the issues of unsafe drinking water on some First Nations reserves? Crickets. Let's get back to Josephine Mandamin. In 2009, the 67-year-old elder returned to school. In 2012, Mandamin received the Anishinaabe Nation Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2013, she graduated from Algoma University with a degree in Anishinaabe. Josephine was a fourth degree member of the Three Fires Mijuwewin Lodge and a member of its Grandmother's Council. She taught about language, culture, identity, and the need to honor and respect all that the Creator has given humankind. In a 2014 London Free Press interview, Mandamin explained what a typical day on a water walk entailed. We'd get up at 2:30 or 3 a.m. and walk until the sun goes down. We'd have an orange or fruit along the way or juice. You have to walk with a pail as if you were walking with a water stream. It's very important to keep the water moving because you've made that promise to keep it moving while you are walking. She also added that, quote, one of the nicest things about people, though, was when they knew we were coming, people would come out and help us out. They'd have supper for us, give us money for hotel rooms. When we crossed into Windsor, there was a committee of people and stopped and said the church was open for us, unquote. In 2016, she received the Lieutenant Governor's Ontario Heritage Award for Excellence in Conservation. In an interview with CBC that year, she reiterated her purpose by stating, quote, when we carry the water, we are telling people that we will go to any lengths for the water. We'll probably even give our lives for the water if we have to, unquote. In 2017, author and illustrator Joanne Robertson released a children's book titled The Water Walker. This book tells the story of grandmother Josephine and her deep love for Nibi, the Anishinaabe word for water. Through vibrant illustrations and helpful pronunciation guides, readers follow Josephine's inspiring walking journey to protect the water. Robertson often shared in interviews that, quote, a lot of grandmothers are fighting to get lakes and rivers personhood, and that seems like an odd thing for a lot of communities to think about lakes and rivers having a spirit and needing rights, unquote. That same year, 75-year-old Josephine Mandamin set out on her final water walk, a more than 8,000-kilometer journey from Spirit Mountain in Duluth, Minnesota to Matane, Quebec. Of this walk, the smiling elder stated, quote, it's been the best I've ever experienced because of the support from people, unquote. As she took her last steps as a water walker, her 14-year mission ended up totaling just over 27,000 kilometers. To put that into perspective, the Trans-Canada Highway, which runs across Canada from coast to coast, is roughly 7,821 kilometers. Therefore, 27,000 kilometers is more than 3 times the length of the Trans-Canada Highway. Incredible. On January 26, 2018, Josephine was awarded the Governor General's Meritorious Service Decoration in recognition of her contributions to Indigenous leadership and reconciliation. Along the way, she also received honors from the Native Women's Association of Canada and the Ontario Native Women's Association. Sadly, on February 22, 2019, Josephine Mandamin died, one day after her 77th birthday. Following her passing, a relative wrote on Facebook that Bidashish, aka Josephine, was an amazing teacher that opened the path for us to stand up for our water and Mother Earth, unquote. As tributes poured in, Glenn Hare, Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation, stated, quote, we have lost a great advocate, teacher, and role model, unquote. In a statement issued shortly following news of her death, Carolyn Bennett, then Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, said Mandamin, quote, taught all of us the fragility of water and the risks that exist to the health and sustainability of our waterways. The important work she started through Mother Earth Water Walk and the Great Lakes Guardians Council lays the foundation for the future of the Great Lakes waterways and for the next 7 generations of water walkers and water warriors from across Turtle Island. Unquote. From 2015 until the time of Mandamin's death, the Canadian government had lifted 88 long term drinking water advisories, but by December 2020, the government admitted it would not meet its March 2021 deadline to remove them all. As of the time I put this together, an additional 5 boil water advisories on Indigenous reserves have been lifted, and 36 remain awaiting a solution, as well as 2 off reserve municipal advisories. Since 2003, pollution levels in the Great Lakes have shown both improvements and ongoing challenges, reflecting the delicate relationship between environmental management efforts and emerging threats. Overall, toxic releases in the Great Lakes Basin have decreased over the 2 decades since Mandamin first started walking. Levels of persistent pollutants, such as polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, have steadily declined since their ban, leading to improved water quality and healthier aquatic ecosystems. Significant progress has been made in remediating what the government deemed areas of concern. The issues that remain for us to continue to try and resolve in Mandamin's absence are harmful algae blooms, or HABs. Lake Erie continues to experience severe algae blooms, primarily due to nutrient runoff from agriculture. Researchers have detected microplastics and emerging contaminants throughout the Great Lakes, which pose risks to aquatic life and potentially enter the human food chain, and requires further study and mitigation efforts. Polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAs, often referred to as, quote, forever chemicals, unquote, have been found across the Great Lakes Basin. These substances are linked to various health issues and are challenging to remove from the environment. Climate change is significantly impacting the Great Lakes, leading to a range of environmental, ecological, and socio-economic effects. Since the mid 1990s, all 5 Great Lakes have experienced an increase in average surface water temperatures. This warming trend affects lake stratification, reduces oxygen levels, and alters habitats for native cold water species such as lake trout and whitefish. Warmer waters also promote the growth of invasive species like zebra mussels. The duration and extent of winter ice cover on the Great Lakes have declined over recent decades, which leads to increased evaporation, contributing to water level fluctuations and impacting species that rely on ice-covered habitats. Warming temperatures and changing ice cover patterns disrupt the life cycles of aquatic species. Cold water fish populations are declining, so we still have a ways to go. In 2022, Sir John A. Macdonald Senior Public School in Brampton was renamed Nibi Imo Saudoing, meaning water walker in English, in honor of Mandamin. And although she is no longer with us in person, her spirit lives on and resides in those who carry on her work. A group called Nibi Imo Saudomejig, those who walk for the water, led by Shirley Williams and her niece Elizabeth Osawamick, has continued to advocate for the protection of water and safe drinking water on Indigenous reserves. Josephine Mandamin also inspired Autumn Peltier, her grandniece, to carry on her aunt's work by becoming a water protector and advocate. Her official title is Chief Water Commissioner for the Anishinaabe Nation, and she is a fierce Indigenous rights and water activist who Josephine would have been proud of. Educational programs and community initiatives have drawn from Josephine's example to emphasize the importance of safeguarding water sources. And on June 13th, 2024, Canada Post released a series of stamps commemorating Indigenous leaders. One of the series features Mandamin. Josephine once said, quote, that water is a human right. We have to understand that water is very precious. We've known for a long time that water is alive. Water can hear you, water can sense what you're saying and what you're feeling. Give it respect, and it can come alive, like anything. Like a person who is sick, if you give them love, take care of them, they'll come alive. Unquote. As we reflect on her message, perhaps you will consider joining me in offering thanks. Bamapi Nokomis Josephine, miigwech for your courage, your teachings, and your love for Nibi. You walked with water, and now you walk among the ancestors. Your footsteps ripple still, your voice flows in the rivers and lakes. May your spirit journey be peaceful, guided by the grandmothers who came before you. We honor you, we thank you, we remember. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode. It's an absolute pleasure to bring you these types of deep dive stories about unique people and places from coast to coast to coast. These stories will always be accessible to everyone, and if you would like to support my work, there are many ways you can do so, including purchasing a paid subscription to Pinecone Diaries or making a small one-time donation. Links for these options will be in the show notes. I truly appreciate your support, and I also love hearing from you and would appreciate it if you could take a moment to type a quick comment letting me know what you liked or didn't like about this week's episode. Your feedback helps me plan for future posts so that I can continue to deliver top quality, well researched, captivating, and engaging stories for you to enjoy. And then, have a rad rest of your day.